Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes to let the Zoom space fill up so that everybody can get as much from this as possible. It's great to see you join in your hundreds. We're really delighted you're all here. Please do say hello in the chat while we're waiting. We'll get going in a couple of minutes. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're just waiting for the Zoom space to fill up a little bit more before we get going. It's great to see so many of you here. Please do say hello in the chat panel while we're waiting. We always like to hear where you're from, what your union is, a bit about yourself. You're all very welcome today. Thank you for those of you who've just sent a message saying the chat seems to not be working at the moment. Yusuf, can I leave that with you in the background just to
Looking
switch
at it as
on?
we speak. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, thanks everyone. Bear with us. We'll get the chat switched on. I think while we're doing that, I will kick things off. So welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm Anna from the TUC. You can see I'm joined by Andrea Oates from the LRD. I'll introduce her a little bit more in a second. As just mentioned, we've got a little problem with the chat at the moment, but we're just trying to get that going. Seems to have just sprung to life, which is great. Please do say hello, where you're from, your union in the chat panel, because we love hearing about what's going on in your workplace. We have kept some time today for questions to Andrea. So do please post them in the Q&A panel, which is at the bottom of the screen. It looks like a speech bubble with a question mark in. We are also using captions today. So if you click the show captions button again at the bottom of the screen, you can follow along with those if you would prefer. And we are, of course, recording as we always do. So if you miss anything or you want to catch up later, don't worry, we'll send you a link to the recording after today's broadcast, along with any resources and links. So today, as I said, we're joined by Andrea Oates from the Labour Research Department. Now, she's a freelance journalist who writes on health and safety issues for the Labour Research Department, or the LRD. Now, the TUC and the LRD are long-lasting and great friends. We work together a lot on joint projects. We use the fantastic research that the LRD do. And the LRD, of course, are there for unions and union branches. They publish all sorts of fantastic information, and their website is full of detail that is helpful to you in your role as a rep. We will be sharing with you an exclusive discount code for one of their publications later in this webinar, so do stay tuned for that. Now, today we're going to be talking about violence at work, and specifically what that means and what you as workplace reps can do to support members and to try and prevent violence at work. So I've got a whole bunch of questions that I'm going to be putting to Andrea about this subject. So first of all, Andrea, before the first question, is there anything you want to add to the introduction about you, maybe about some of the things you've worked on in the past that you want to highlight? And then I'll put the first question to you. 1 second, Andrea. We're just trying to unmute your mic.
So,
go for it.
Yeah. So as Anna said, I'm a freelance journalist, member of the NUJ. And one of my main pieces of work is writing health and safety content for Labour Research Department publications. So that includes features for Labour Research magazine, the guides. And the reason that I'm speaking today is because I wrote the Protecting Workers from Violence and Abuse at Work guide for LRD, and I also contribute to the LRD's digital publication, monthly publication Safety Rep. And violence and abuse is something that just comes up again and again and again. And when I'm looking at looking at what information unions have put out, this is it's always it's been a massive problem for a long time, and it continues to be a massive kind of increasing problem. So
Thanks, Andrea. So that leads us nicely into my first question. Can you tell me what we mean by violence at work? I think we all know what violence is, but what specifically do you mean by violence at work? And can you give me a couple of examples, please?
yeah, so the HSE, the Health and Safety Executive, I'm sure you all know this is Safety Reps, isn't it? The safety regulator defines work-related violence as any incident in which a person is abused, threatened, or assaulted in circumstances related to their work. And so that includes verbal abuse and threats. That includes face-to-face, online and via the telephone, as well as physical attacks. And it can come from members of the public, customers, clients, patients, service users, students, towards a person at work. So, there's some really horrendous examples from unions about their members being attacked, and some unfortunately last year both Unite and RMT reported that they had members who were killed at work in violent assaults last year. But one of the sort of images that sticks in my mind is a photograph that the POA published in its magazine with a prison officer with the whole of his head kind of split open by an attack with a sort of weapon made out of a razor blade. But it's also verbal abuse, people being shouted at in shops. So yeah, and over the telephone as well. Just sort of people, being threatened. People are being followed home from work, for example. What the HSE says isn't violence at work, or it doesn't consider to be violence at work. It says that it's got to be in connection with the work activity, and so it excludes personal disputes between workers and other people, such as family members, and violence between people not at work, such as customers and service users. But unions argue, for example, that domestic violence is a workplace issue. And so when you're looking at kind of negotiating policies around violence, that's something to sort of consider. Unions like PCS, for example, in job centres have said that employers should be looking at how to reduce incidents where customers or service users are violent towards each other, because that obviously has a kind of impact on staff as well. And some unions also, their guidance on violence and abuse also includes racial and sexual harassment, for example. So hopefully that's given you some examples of sort of what is and isn't.
It really has, Andrea, thanks. And I think what was helpful there is to hear what isn't classified as violence at work as much as what is. And it doesn't mean that it's not important, but we've got other help and guidance on those. So you mentioned, for example, domestic violence at work, and that should be included when negotiating policies on this. We at the TUC have got some separate guidance for reps on domestic violence at work. We'll make sure that we get that link sent out to you all, because of course it should all be looked at in the round here when considering these issues. Okay, so next question. Why is this a particular priority for unions at the moment? Have you got evidence that this is on the up, that's on the rise? What are unions telling us about this?
Yeah, so I think what unions would say is that kind of official statistics, particularly where incidents have to be reported under the RIDDOR reporting regulations, kind of underestimate the level of violence and abuse that their members are dealing with. And as I said at the beginning, I think unions have been concerned about violence and abuse for a long time. But they say that the situation's worsened over recent years, and that includes during the height of the COVID pandemic, levels of violence increased for many groups of workers who had to enforce sometimes sort of unpopular COVID rules. So in areas like retail and transport and health and social care. And the levels have remained high after that. I think on top of that, last summer we saw the wave of far right and racist violence that swept across the country in August. And even before that happened, unions were already reporting that groups of their members were suffering horrific and rising levels of aggression and abuse. So just, I mean, I've kind of got, there's been lots and lots of union surveys, both before we published the booklet, the guide, and after. But I just thought I'd kind of, just give you some figures, but also give you some quotes. So these aren't the only, as I say, there have been a lot of research, and surveys published by unions demonstrating the impact of the extent of the problem. But for example, this is a quote from the GMB, and they say, from the care sector to the gig economy, from retail to hospitals, from schools to security, verbal and physical abuse is a daily reality for workers, to the extent that most never consider to report incidents to their employers, as it's simply an accepted part of the job. In August 2024, Unite reported historic levels of abuse at the Scottish Ambulance Survey. Only 15% said that they hadn't suffered any form of abuse. Us door shop workers unions, they do an annual Freedom from Fear survey as part of a kind of wider campaign to tackle violence. That shows that every minute of every day, another shop worker is abused, threatened, or assaulted. And last year, the POA, Prison Officers Association, reported an average of 23 assaults per day in prison. And I think I was at a meeting yesterday. I think somebody from the POA said that that's actually increased to 28 assaults per day in prisons. And last year, violence against staff had increased by 190% and serious assaults on staff by 145% since 2010. So not surprisingly, when LRD asked unions about their priorities for 2025, many highlighted violence as one of their top priorities. And just going back to that quote from the GMB, unions are very clear that it might be a daily occurrence for their members, but violence and abuse should never be part of the job. And the GMB said, even in the most challenging circumstances where those receiving care or education are known to have violent tendencies, there are always actions that can improve the situation and reduce risk. And so I think it's a priority because, that's the important bit, safety reps, that there are things that employers can do, and safety reps are the ones to kind of make sure that they do put those, policies and procedures and practices into place.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting, if not concerning, the amount that unions are reporting this as a concern of their members. While Andrea was speaking, we posted a few links in the chat to some of these specific reports that unions have produced. Do take a look at those, or we'll send you the link so you can follow up on some of them afterwards. So you've already mentioned a couple of unions and occupational groups that have highlighted this, but have we got any evidence of particular groups that are at risk of this a bit more than others, either by sector or by perhaps a characteristic, gender, ethnicity, etc.?
Yeah, so the HSE statistics say that those in protective service occupations, so that includes the police and prison officers, face the highest risk of assaults and threats while working, 6 times the average risk across all occupations. And they also highlight health and social care associate professionals. That includes nurses, midwives, paramedics and radiographers. And they had a higher than average risk at 4.4%. But union surveys show high levels of violence and abuse across a whole range of sectors and occupations. And I was just looking at the chat there. So apologies if I, don't mention the area that you're working in, because this isn't an exhaustive list. And I noticed that somebody, said you'd be surprised how bad it is in libraries. It's kind of, it feels like it's sort of quite a pervasive issue wherever, wherever people are delivering a service to the public, not just public services, but, in retail or hospitality, in transport, in schools, utilities, both sort of water and energy. Unions have highlighted problems, sometimes when there's particular things going on. But, for example, I know water workers have faced issues when there's, been a lot around sewage dumping in rivers, and then they kind of get the blame from, the company having a bad reputation or whatever. Energy workers, just so many. I mean, my own, I was just thinking, my own sector, the NUJ just put out a report, or actually Amnesty put out a report about journalists in Northern Ireland and sort of death threats from paramilitary organisations, but also organised crime groups. That, I think one positive thing, or I don't know whether you'd call it a silver lining or whatever, but people are speaking out against it, which I think in the past, they haven't been. And then just in terms of protected characteristics, I know the RCN Nurses Union, which I'll sort of go on to talk about union guidance further on, but they say that employers should be collecting data that's broken down by protected characteristics so that they can identify whether particular groups of workers are more at risk of attack or whatever. And I think women, because they work in areas like health and social care and education or whatever, there's a high proportion of women. Black workers, because they're also facing sort of racial harassment and racial violence as well, and disabled workers and trans workers who are sort of there's kind of hate crimes around that as well, on top of the job that they're doing. And I think union guidance kind of emphasises that needs to be taken into account by employers as well. So sort of good data monitoring, making sure that they know about attacks and the characteristics of people who are being attacked or abused. And as I say, apologies if I've missed any sectors or occupations out, but I think it's, it is. I was quite surprised at the HSE. I mean, it's only a fairly, not brief report. It's not a massively detailed report, but I was surprised they didn't highlight more, kind of sectors and occupations where people are at increased risk, because the union evidence suggests a lot more workers are at risk. So
Thanks, Andrea. And I've also been tracking some of what's in the chat. I've made a note of a couple of things that we can pick up on a bit later. I was astonished about the libraries point. I love a library, regularly in them. Mercifully, I've never witnessed anything, but it's going to make me open my eyes a bit more now to what the people who work there have to deal with. That's quite a shock. But we'll come back to some of these sectoral specific things a bit later. Okay. When we think about violence in any aspect of life, we think, well, it's against the law. So what is the law here? How can we use the law? Or how is the law unhelpful when we're dealing with violence at work?
Okay, so I'll start off by talking about health and safety law, and then I'll go on to talk about kind of the law that health and safety law is criminal law, but the law enforced by the police and sort of where somebody is actually assaulted. I mean, one of the things unions point to as a kind of cause of violence is kind of a lack of enforcement and accountability of perpetrators as a factor, along with other things. I think the problem is, or a problem is, that we've only got general health and safety laws. So we've got the Health and Safety at Work Act, and we've got the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations. And, you know, guidance from the Health and Safety Executive is clear that employers should assess the risk of violence and aggression in the same way as they assess any other risks, and they should put in place measures to prevent or control the risks. But we don't have any specific regulations, just, the same as stress as well. There's no specific regulations in the same way that there's a set of regulations around controlling noise or chemicals or manual handling or work equipment. So there's that problem that we haven't got any sort of specific, we haven't got a specific set of regulations setting out what employers should do. There's also a problem with the RIDDOR regulations, the regulations under which employers have to report incidents of violence to the enforcement authorities. That means that most instances of work-related violence go unreported to the HSE or local authorities, because they only require a report to be made if a worker requires hospitalisation for more than 24 hours or is unable to perform their normal working duties for more than 7 days. So unions are demanding changes to the law. And I'm sure you know that as part of the Labour government's manifesto commitments to make work pay, they've promised to carry out a review of health and safety regulations and guidance to make sure that they're fit for purpose for modern workplaces. And no doubt unions will be pushing forward these demands. So, for example, the GMBs called for 3 key reforms to the law on violence at work. And that's to amend the Health and Safety at Work Act to make it explicit that work-related violence is within scope of the Act, to create new regulations to detail the approach and methods expected of all employers in controlling violence risks at work, and to create new reporting requirements for work-related violence so that all instances of violence and aggression are recorded, allowing for identification of trends and hotspots. And then also unions, including Unison, are calling for the ILO, International Labour Organization, Convention 190, which is like an international convention on harassment and violence in the workplace, which the UK government ratified in, I think, 2022, to be properly implemented in the UK. And that requires governments to adopt, in consultation with employer and worker representatives, an inclusive, integrated and gender responsive approach for the prevention and elimination of violence and harassment in the world of work. And if you've not looked at that already, I think it's a good framework for what government and employers should be doing to sort of prevent and control violence at work. The other, and then I suppose the other side of it is the kind of assault, the law around assaults that the police enforce. So unions have sort of pushed for a series of improvements to the law, because in the past, I think probably still there's a perception that the police don't always take incidents of work-related violence seriously enough and pursue a prosecution. And so unions have pushed for there to be kind of like an enhanced offence, or make it a more serious offence to assault emergency workers during the course of their duties. In Scotland, there's sort of enhanced laws for hospitality and I think it's retail workers dealing with sort of age, where there's a restriction on age-related products like alcohol or whatever. And Usdaw has got a commitment from the government, I think it's going through at the moment in the crime and policing bill, to have a specific offence for assaulting a shop worker in the course of their work. I think what unions would say is that is important, and they're sort of campaigning for those laws to be improved, so that it means that people get harsher sentences if they're convicted of those offences. But I think the real priority for unions is on the sort of health and safety law side, and kind of making sure that those laws around preventing and controlling violence in the first place are stronger, and actually are enforced as well. I mean, that's the other issue. So I think it's quite rare for the HSE to take a case, to prosecute an employer over violence at work. There have been some examples, but when you look through the HSE press releases, there's far more prosecutions around people falling, or around chemicals. Not to say that they shouldn't be prosecuted, but that violence is kind of, they're few and far between from what I've seen. So I think, and just to say, having effective laws is really important, but I think what really makes a difference is having good union organisation with safety reps, using their legal rights with the backing of their members. And I think the key focus of the guide has been on kind of, union advice to reps on what they can do to tackle workplace violence. So we would like better laws, but key is safety reps backed up by their members, and kind of collective strength in the workplace.
Absolutely. And we're going to come on to some examples of that in a minute. But this is a great moment for Andrea and I to also ask you, the audience, to share any stories with us. At the moment, I can see that you're sharing a lot of examples of violence at work, which we, of course, do want to hear about. Keep them coming. But we also want to know about any success stories. Have you been able to use any of these issues to organise in your workplace and make a change? Tell us about them if you have. You can either post them in the chat, or if it's a really long story, please do email it to us at tuceducation@tuc.org.uk. We'll put that email address in the chat as well. So do tell us about the bad instances, but also please do tell us about any positive changes you've been able to make by organising and by getting your members together collectively to talk to your employer about these, to make a change. So we're going to move on to, in a minute, some of the ways you can do that, but do share as well if you've already been able to do this. So as reps, as safety reps, we all know that you've got your role in the workplace can often fall into two categories. You're either supporting members who might come to you because they've been attacked or because there's been an incident at work, but you can also be involved in the prevention side, which we're going to come to now, about having policies in place that hold the employer to account, to make sure that as much is done as possible before these instances could even happen. So what sort of things, Andrea, can reps do? What sort of things can they include in policies to prevent this, to make sure that everyone knows what's at stake, and what standards can be expected ahead of time?
So I was just going to kind of run through, say that the guide kind of I'll go on to sort of union guidance around some of the solutions or whatever, or some of the sort of key things. I mean, I also wanted to just flag up the HSE advice, which is, it's a 5-step approach, the same as for any other health and safety issue. Sort of identify the hazards, assess the risks, decide how to control the risks, put the right measures in place, check how well the arrangements are working. And their advice covers areas like workplace design, job design, training, de-escalation techniques, ensuring incidents are reported, and learning from incidents, keeping records of violent incidents, and also the support that employers should provide where there's a violent incident. So I've tried to summarise some of the union guidance on this. And I think the first thing to say is that every workplace is different, and there's no single simple solution in most workplaces. But some of the pointers from across unions about, I suppose, safety reps approach, but also, the employer's approach and what should go into a workplace policy on violence. So the emphasis should always be on prevention and control, the same hierarchy as with all health and safety risks. Trying to prevent violence at the very top or whatever. And there should be a clear violence prevention policy in the workplace that unions have had a say in in the development of that policy. And some of the things that are kind of just across unions, they hopefully don't sound too obvious, but staffing levels should be appropriate throughout the day and the night, and that's that comes up again and again around. What I also meant to say earlier on was, although the causes of violence, are different across different sectors, a lot of it comes down to money. So not enough money for additional support needs in Scottish schools, for example, the EIS talk about. Unison Scotland did a survey where it was a lot of frustration around cuts to services, and services not being available, or people having to wait a long time for them, and not enough staff, too much lone working. So they're kind of all really important things to kind of include in a policy. Then if there is an incident, there should be policies and procedures in place to deal with those incidents, and staff should be trained and prepared and know what to do in the event of an incident, including emergency procedures. And the guide provides information about protection under Section 44 of the Employment Rights Act and the right to withdraw from workplaces where there's a serious and imminent danger. And I'm sure, that safety reps will know about that law because it came up again and again during COVID. Also, I think it's important to recognise that abuse, threats, and violence can happen on the journey to and from work. So it's not just in the workplace. Working alone should be avoided where possible, particularly late at night or other kind of high risk times. Reporting systems that work are really important, so making it as simple as possible to report. The design of the workplace and the surroundings are important. Personal alarms, mobile phones, sort of personal protective equipment and clothing, again, they're important, but it's important to recognise that PPE is lower down in the hierarchy. It should deal with residual risks after prevention and control measures have been considered. And as I sort of referred to earlier, the Nurses Union sort of advises collecting data on assaults and incidents at both local and national level, and using that to identify trends and hotspots. And it should be collected and reviewed in terms of the protective characteristics of the staff assaulted, to see if there's particular groups of staff that are particularly at risk, and then do something about it. And I think very important is that there should be union involvement and consultation in policies and in violence reductions strategies. And the RCN highlights, for example, where there's new technology being introduced, such as lone worker devices or body-worn cameras, it's really important that safety reps are involved in that, any of those kind of developments. And then just some examples of union resources. So the NEU, I noticed that in the chats, some people have talked about, what about violent instances in schools with sort of students. The NEU's got a very good model policy setting out how a school should, prevent workplace violence and procedures that will be followed if a violent incident occurs. And it includes a zero tolerance approach, includes liaison with the police. And they've also developed or revamped a violence survey that reps can use to conduct surveys at school level, and then they send it back into the union, and they produce a report that reps can share with their members and use in negotiations with management. And I think, reps will say that local surveys are a really good way of involving members and actually non-members. sort of recruit and build union organisation and strength. Sometimes that could be a really useful thing to do. And I think particularly if the union head office is helping with that analysis kind of thing. Unison's got a sort of 10-point violence at work charter for employers to sign up to. Unite's got a roadmap to improve bus worker safety in Scotland. Unfortunately, that was developed after a bus driver died after an assault. But that includes joint working with the local authority, with police, with employers and the unions. One thing that I also wanted to mention was the Wales TUC ran a webinar. I'm not sure if it's recorded, where they looked at the Cardiff model for violence reduction, and that's like a public health approach to violence prevention, and it brings a range of agencies together to sort of tackle violence. And I'll post in the chat afterwards, or send over to Anna. It's called the Cardiff Model for Violence Prevention, and it was done by researchers at Cardiff University. So that's maybe something that will be useful. I know people who were at the Wales TUC webinar found that useful. So that's kind of some of the resources. And again, I apologise if I've tried to mention as many unions as possible, and but they've all got really good resources. The unions where this is an issue for their members, I think they're all kind of campaigning around this and putting out information on it. But yeah, so it's just in a short webinar you kind of can't mention everything that's going on. But.
Absolutely. And like Andrea just said, please do take a look at your union website to see if this is something they're already campaigning on. If you feel it's something they should be campaigning on, if it's something you're experiencing at work, by all means bring it up via your branch and via your structures so that it becomes an issue that they take forward. That you need sometimes maybe need to give them the information about what is happening on the ground in the workplace. As if it's something you're experiencing, by all means, let them know. So we've talked a lot about policies and the preventative side of things. If reps are in a position where they may be supporting a member who have been on the receiving end of violence at work, if they've been attacked, have you got any advice for them? I mean, obviously every case is different, but have you got any general tips and information that they can think about?
Yeah, so I was just looking at I was just kind of hunting around for guidance on this, and I was just looking at some guidance that Unison put out on tackling violence at work a while ago. And what they say is, that an assault on a worker can have devastating consequences, not only for the individual, but also their colleagues and actually the whole organisation. And it's vital that support and assistance is at hand. And trade union safety reps are a vital part of this support process. But actually it's employers who are legally responsible for the safety and welfare of their workers. And so I think what they're saying is that the role of the safety rep is to make sure that this support is in place. So in the policy and in reality, there should be support during and immediately after an incident, in the short term and in the long term. And so some of the things that they talk about is sort of, during and immediately after the incident, people need to know they've got the support of their employer, and that could include security staff, but actually it might include the police if it's a serious incident. They may need first aid and medical assessment, and just colleagues asking if they're okay. And a supportive line manager who should make sure that the incident's recorded and investigated. They might need just a coffee break. They might need to go home, but that there needs to be something in place that people know what is going to happen, and it does happen. If there is an incident. In the short term, they might need a change of work area or in the type of work they do. They might need regular meetings with their line manager to talk about any problems, a discussion about what can be learned from the incident, and advice from occupational health services. Obviously, you know, that's another union campaign to get decent occupational health services. But if it's there, then you know, there should be advice from occupational health. And then in the long term, you know, there may be issues with post-traumatic stress disorder. So one of the things that I meant to say and didn't say earlier on is around the risks of violence, that it's not just physical injuries, but it's also, you know, can have an impact on people's mental health, including sort of fear and anxiety about being attacked, you know, the sort of threat of violence or abuse. And there may be independent counselling services, so some employers do provide that. If they need time off, it shouldn't be counted as sick leave. Yeah, and also that staff, you know, workers need to know that the incident is going to be treated seriously. You know, I've talked about by the employer, and I've also talked a bit about unions campaigning for the, you know, for the police to take that seriously where that's appropriate.
Thanks, thanks, Andrea. I'm going to turn now to some of the questions that we've had submitted from viewers, and a couple of things I've noted that have come up in the chat while we've been talking. Right, so a viewer has said that they find the LRD resources and information like really helpful. It explains the legal situation and what our rights are in these situations very clearly. But what advice have you got to ensure that this is enforced and like applied in these situations? We might know what the law is, but how can we make sure that it's followed?
Yeah. I mean, I was going to kind of come on to some success stories, so maybe that's a good time to kind of
Absolutely. Let's have some positivity.
Yeah. So I think, you know, I said earlier that yeah, it's great to have the law, isn't it? You know, and it's great to have that agency guidance about what employers should do. But I think it often comes down to the collective strength of the union branch and what they're prepared to do. So, for example, the NASUWT Teachers Union has got a kind of, you know, a whole policy around violence and abuse and pupil behaviour. And they've actually won some improvement in schools through taking strike action, which, you know, is kind of the, I suppose, the ultimate action that you can take as a union. And they've highlighted a number of examples where the employers agreed to work with the union to put new policies and procedures in place following industrial action over pupil behaviour. So USDOR at kind of national level have used their Freedom of Fear campaign to work with the police on pilot projects to improve reporting of incidents and use the evidence gained to deal with prolific offenders. And they've got improved security measures in stores, including body-worn cameras and proper risk assessment. So I suppose that's kind of at the other end, of sort of more collaborative, you know, working with good employers, I think, to try and, you know, working with good employers and working with the police to kind of to win improvements. And I mean, also they highlight the lobbying that they've done. So they've got some commitments from Labour in government to sort of, you know, increase community policing and introduce this new offence of assaulting a shop worker. Unite's Get Me Home Safely, I think, is a really good example of, you know, that's a campaign where they've improved safety for people getting home from work late at night, particularly. So, and I kind of think that that campaign is an example of kind of thinking out the box, because it's not just with employers that they've worked with local authorities to introduce requirements for hospitality employers to pay for safe transport home for workers leaving venues late at night as part of licensing requirements. So, you know, alcohol licenses, the local authority can impose conditions on that venue or that, you know, the licensee. So I think that's a you know, a good example. I know it's kind of outside the workplace or whatever. And the other, yeah, I mean, I'd really like to be able to tell you about, more successful action to tackle violence at work by safety reps in their workplaces, but it's really hard to find examples. And I think obviously you're all really busy people, and I think, safety reps go to their unions when they've got a problem, for information, and they deal with the problem, but they kind of really feedback success because people are busy and they're on to the next problem to sort of sort out. But I think those examples are so vital for helping other reps, to tackle violence and abuse in their workplaces. And so that's always brilliant to have those examples to sort of put into LRD guides, because it just makes it, like you say, you can have all that information about the law and guidance, but it's just great to have information where well, how has a rep done something. But I do have one example from a former Prison Officers Association rep, and they use their rights under Section 44, I think, to they'd had an incident where a member of staff had been choked unconscious the previous night. And they withdrew to a place of safety. But this escalated, and there was an injunction put in place to force people back to work that went to the High Court. But the chair of the branch had kept a log of violence and instability data for the previous year, and they forced the employer to settle out of court. And also, it resulted in a legally binding safety protocol being put in place, stating that members were entitled to withdraw in this manner, and management at each prison had to meet with the local branch when safety concerns were raised and facilitate any resolution being fed back to the branch. I mean, this is a few years ago, but the POA described this as a landmark agreement by the prison service, which for the first time commits managers to a legally binding procedure for addressing urgent health and safety concerns, and ensure that the POA can advise members of their health and safety rights without being accused of unlawfully inducing industrial action. And obviously the POA is still fighting for its right to take strike action. So and that started in a branch with the branch chair kind of as a sort of rep taking action. And it would be great to be able to include more examples of what is actually going on in the workplace.
So do please send those to us if you hear about them, or if you do have a success story. Do please tell us so that we can share them with everyone who uses TUC or LRD resources. Hopefully some of the examples that Andrea shared with us there of successes have given you some ideas and some inspiration about how you can enforce the rights that we have, or the law in this area. Right, we've had quite a few questions about education settings, or when there's violence from children towards employees, workers, which is perhaps sort of a little bit of a different, not different, but perhaps needs some more careful thought. Have you got any, or we've had lots of different questions about it, but I think if we're able to talk a bit more generally about these situations when the perpetrator of the violence is a child or an adult, perhaps with special needs, what things do we need to think about there?
So I kind of I'm just looking through the stuff that, I mean, in the booklet I included guidance from the Violence in Schools guide from the GMB, and I mean things like I mean, I suppose these sort of I mean the GMB guide, for example, has got what should be in a what should be in a policy to prevent violence in schools. So they'd say having a clear violence prevention policy which is prominently displayed and which all staff, parents, pupils and visitors are aware of. Again, ensuring staff levels are appropriate. Establishing emergency procedures, ensuring that nobody works alone in potential high-risk situations. And I was just looking at the I was looking at the NEU model policy, because I think what you're probably talking about is where an incident's occurred. So their model policy includes, kind of a pupil behaviour risk assessment, for example, that they've got quite detailed guidance around that. So where the behaviour of an individual pupil represents a demonstrable and ongoing risk to health, safety and well-being to other members of the school community, an individual behaviour risk assessment will be considered. So I've not, and they kind of include information about, what kind of situations a pupil behaviour risk assessment and individual pupils behaviour risk assessment will include. But I've kind of not gone into a huge amount of detail in the guide on that, just because it's kind of, you're always limited by, it's a kind of intended as a sort of generalist publication rather than kind of
Sure.
being able to go sort of too far.
Sure, absolutely understand. What I will add here for our audience is that obviously we're all online here together today, sharing ideas and sharing experiences. But our webinars aren't the only way that reps can do that. The TUC is having an event on the 15th of July, so just over a month from now, in Manchester about the upcoming Employment Rights Act. So all union reps are welcome to attend this. We'll put the information in the chat panel in a minute or two. LRD will be there as well. I'm not sure if Andrea herself is going to be there, but the LRD will be there, where you'll be able to ask them questions, ask us questions, but crucially, meet other union reps and find out what they're doing. So basically, a longer experience than what you've had today. There'll also be speakers from Thompson's, the employment law firm, about all the upcoming changes. So do sign up for that if you're interested. It's, of course, a great way to share experiences and to share ideas. The other facility that the TUC has for reps to ask questions is our community website, unionreps.org.uk. Please do post a question there. If you've got one, you might be able to get information from a fellow site user, or of course you might be able to answer one. So the conversation doesn't end at 3 o'clock when we finish this webinar. It can go on, and we can keep talking to each other about what's going on in the workplace. Okay, Andrea, I'm going to move on to the next set of questions that we've had, which is all around reporting. So you mentioned quite a lot about how important it is for people who experience violence at work to report it, to make sure we're recording this, especially around protected characteristics, so that we can start to see patterns and trends and that sort of thing. And of course, so that we can do something about it. A few people have posted to say that their members sometimes see violence at work as just part of the job, so they don't report it, or that it could perhaps, there's a concern that it might make a workplace look bad if there's a high instance of violence, so maybe a school or a hospital or something. Have you got any advice really about what we can do to encourage members to report more, so that we can do all the things that you mentioned earlier, bearing in mind the concerns that people might have?
Yeah, and just if I could just quickly go back to the last question as well. Just I just wanted to say as well, I couldn't find it when I was sort of trying to flick through the guide, but I'm sure somewhere in there there's some guidance from the RCN around when it's appropriate to withdraw care. And I think that was within the context of sort of racist violence, particularly after the
That
sort
is
of
helpful.
yeah.
Thank you.
So that's one sort of thing about, and also there's a kind of, in I think the ambulance service as well has kind of markers so that people know that, either, it's tricky, isn't it, around withdrawing care, but I think there is there is guidance from those unions that have health workers, around that. In terms of reporting, I think it was a TUC slogan, wasn't it, around report it to sort it. So I think there's been quite a big kind of union focus on, making sure that members don't feel like it's just part of the job. Like, even though, we've talked about how widespread violence and abuse is, and it's such a big problem in such a lot of sectors. But it's, I think I said at the beginning of the beginning of the webinar, that the union view is that there's always something that can be done to sort of prevent it. So I think it's really important. And I think unions are kind of, there's quite a lot of union resources around, encouraging members to report incidents. And also, it's important that employers make it clear that people should report it, because otherwise it's, it remains. I was talking about the kind of, we've got sets of regulations around noise and chemicals, and if it's not reported, it kind of stays under the radar. So I think it's important to just keep encouraging people to report, and maybe if you're doing survey work, that's part of the message that goes out with that survey about how important it is to make sure that it's being reported, and also that the employer is keeping records. So as well as as well as the sort of statutory obligations to report more serious incidents to the regulator, that they're also, they're keeping records. So people are reporting, the employer can see what the problem is, and they've got data to look at kind of, whether there's trends or hotspots or whatever. And in terms of it kind of making the employer look bad, I mean, that information is internal information, actually, isn't it? So there's no, I think it's worse, isn't it? It shows it's a bad employer if they're not encouraging people to sort of report the problem, and that indicates that they're not interested in trying to do something about it. So I suppose maybe turning it around to say that a good employer does encourage its workers to report the problem so that they can do something about it.
Thanks, Andrew. I think that's a good point there about when a rep is speaking to the employer to say, it's part of their responsibility, isn't it? It's part of their duty of care to make sure they get this information. But from the rep's point of view, when you have a success, when you have like a good outcome from something, from a report that's made, obviously without breaching confidentiality, but tell members about it. Say, look, we've managed to get this change made because we had information in. I think that will build members' confidence in the union, in the rep, in the union activity in the workplace, and we'll get more of them behind you. So hopefully, the more you can get more information and can make further changes. So much as you would about any subject, talk to your members, get the information in, make a change, but then tell them about it. Make sure they know what you're doing and what you've been able to achieve with the information that you have. We're going to wrap up in a minute because it's very nearly 3 o'clock, and it's almost time for us to go. So I've got one final question for you, Andrea, which only needs to be, short. I don't want to. We've got to go soon, but we've obviously seen that this is a real problem at work. Violence is a real issue. Have you got any thoughts or evidence as to why this seems to be on the up? Why we're seeing more of it?
So I think COVID is a factor. As I said, it was kind of, I think I've read some evidence around, so as well as workers having to enforce those unpopular, rules, there's also kind of I don't know, like around people who work in the police service. Maybe there's kind of sort of um, what's the word? Sort of less respect for people in authority or whatever. I think the cost of living crisis is, Usdaw, I think 7 in 10 of their of sort of incidents of violence and aggression are linked to theft. And yeah, I mean austerity as well, because we've seen kind of we've seen services cut, and yeah, I mean there's a kind of whole range of issues. Yeah, and I suppose social media as well, that you kind of, there's that kind of online abuse that's much more, it is kind of more pervasive, isn't it? That's kind of going on as well. So I think there's a kind of combination of factors. Yeah, but I do think, the role of the safety rep and using their legal rights is really important in trying to kind of um, in terms of tackling it as well. Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if this is a positive note. Some of the changes that will come in around the employment rights bill and making it easier for people to have access to unions, and some of those provisions around that Labour promised around making it easier to unionise, and for yeah, just that kind of, we want to see an increase in unionisation and union activity to kind of counter this, I think. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good note for us to finish on. Is that we can keep sharing experiences and sharing tips and advice, and hopefully you've been able to see, Andrea, that lots of people have found what we've been saying incredibly helpful, and really useful, which is great. So thank you very much for joining me today, Andrea. It's been really insightful. Thank you to all of you in the audience for joining us. We'll be back again next week with another webinar. And let's keep the conversation going on unionreps.org.uk, where you can post questions and speak to other reps. But for now, it's bye bye from us, and we'll see you again soon.